There is a confession that Sir Bobby Charlton carried for decades. Not a confession of wrongdoing and not a confession of failure. It was something far more unsettling, a confession of inadequacy from one of the greatest players England ever produced. Bobby Charlton survived Munich, lifted the World Cup in 1966, scored in a European Cup final, and became the very symbol of English football's soul. And yet he once looked at a teammate and felt something he rarely felt in his entire career. He felt small. He said it plainly, without hesitation. Duncan was the only player that made me feel inferior. Think carefully about what that means. If Bobby Charlton is a king, and by every measure he was, then Duncan Edwards was something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a clean title in the history of the game. Something closer to a force of nature wearing a red shirt. This is the story of a spectre. A titan who walked the earth for 21 years and left a vacuum so vast that English football has spent nearly 7 decades trying to fill it. Duncan Edwards was not simply a great footballer. He was a blueprint for a style of play that the sport would not fully understand for another 20 years. He was a ghost who arrived too early, burned too bright, and disappeared before the world had time to understand what it was watching. This is the story of the greatest what if in the history of the game. To understand Duncan Edwards, you have to understand where he came from, because the place shaped everything about him. Dudley, in the heart of the Black Country, was not a soft place in the 1940s. It smelled of coal smoke and hot iron, and the streets were narrow and the winters were long and grey. The men who worked the foundries and the mines carried the weight of that labour in their shoulders and their silence, and they passed that weight onto their children without ever saying a word about it. It was a place that built people from the inside out, and Duncan Edwards was built there. He was born on the 1st of October 1936, the son of Gladstone and Sarah Ann Edwards, and he grew up on the Priory estate, kicking a football on every patch of ground he could find, in every weather, against anyone willing to face him. By the time he was 11 years old, a schoolmaster watching him play reportedly said he told all 21 other players what to do and where to go, and that included the referee and the linesman. At 14, a Manchester United scout sent a note back to Matt Busby that read, "I have today seen a boy who merits special watching. His name is Duncan Edwards of Dudley." Busby did not need to be told twice. He had been building something at Old Trafford, a generation of young players who had come to be known as the Busby Babes, and he knew immediately that Duncan Edwards was the cornerstone of everything he was trying to create. The signing itself became the stuff of legend, and it nearly didn't happen at all. Wolverhampton Wanderers, just a few miles up the road from Dudley, were the strong favourites to land him. Every major club in England wanted him, and Wolves had geography and history on their side. So Busby drove south through the night, arriving at the Edwards family home in the early hours of Duncan's 16th birthday, the 1st of October 1952. There was tea on the table, there was a contract on the table, and there was a boy who had always wanted to play for Manchester United sitting across from the man who had always wanted to sign him. He signed without hesitation. Wolves manager Stan Cullis was furious and accused United of improper conduct, but Duncan had made his choice, and that choice would change the history of English football forever. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because Duncan Edwards was not just a great footballer by the standards of his era. He was a tactical anomaly, a player who existed 20 years before the language too. Describe him had even been invented. The term total football would not enter the football world until the Dutch Revolution of the early 1970s, when Rinus Michels and Johan Cruyff showed the world what a truly positionless player could do. But Duncan Edwards was already doing it in 1955, on muddy English pitches with a heavy leather ball, before anyone had a name for what they were watching. He played as a left half, which in the language of the 1950s meant a defensive midfielder. But that label was a cage that could never hold him. He was faster than most wingers on the pitch, stronger than most centre-backs, and more technically gifted than most forwards. He could spray a 60-yard diagonal pass with the precision of a surgeon and then, seconds later, arrive in the opposition penalty area like a freight train that had been gathering speed for half the length of the pitch. Matt Busby said in 1957, "In Duncan Edwards, I believe I have the greatest footballer in the world." John. Charles is bigger and has all the skills. Alfredo Di Stefano is a mature artist, but Duncan can play anywhere without question and do a great job. That was Busby comparing his 20-year-old to the two greatest players on the planet and finding them both wanting. His shot was the stuff of legend among everyone who saw it. The heavy leather balls of the 1950s were waterlogged, dense, and brutal on the foot, but they were weapons in his hands. He struck them with a force that made goalkeepers flinch before the ball had even left his boot. His last goal on English soil came on the 1st of February 1958 at Highbury, a blistering, long-range effort that opened the scoring in a 5-4 win over Arsenal. A 15-year-old Terry Venables was in the crowd that day, and he stood there watching and thought, "That is what I want to be." Years later, when Venables opened a private club in West London, he hung an oil painting of Duncan Edwards on the wall, because some images stay with you for the rest of your life. Bobby Charlton, who trained alongside him every single day and knew his game better than almost anyone alive, tried to put it into words in later years. "I'd seen tough players, fast players, intelligent players, and good passers of the ball, but never anyone that could do the whole lot. In one Army Cup tie, United were losing 4-2 with the game nearly over, and Edwards moved to centre forward. In 10 minutes, he scored 4 goals and United won 7-4. That is not a statistic. That is a myth made real on a football pitch. There is another dimension to his game that the numbers cannot fully capture. He was listed at 5 feet 11 inches and 13.5 stone. A man-child physique that looked, even at 16, like it belonged to a seasoned professional of 10 years' experience. But he did not move like a big man. He moved like a ghost through a crowd, gliding past opponents with a change of pace that left them grasping at air. Defenders who tried to bully him found themselves bounced off the ball. Defenders who tried to outrun him found themselves watching his back disappear into the distance. There was no answer to him. There was only the question of how much damage he would do before the final whistle. By the winter of 1957, England had a problem that most nations would have killed for. They had Duncan Edwards at the peak of his powers. He had earned 18 caps for the senior national team, scoring 5 goals, and he was only 21 years old. He had played in all 4 of England's qualifying matches for the 1958 World Cup in Sweden, and was widely expected to replace the veteran Billy Wright as England captain. The football writers of the era were not cautious in their assessments. They believed England were going to Sweden with a weapon that no other nation in the world possessed, and they were almost certainly right. Consider what that World Cup looked like without him. England went to Sweden in 1958 and were eliminated in the group stage, failing to win a single match in normal time. They drew with the Soviet Union, drew with Brazil, drew with Austria, and then lost a playoff to the Soviets. They were a team without a spine, without a heartbeat, without the one player who could have changed the entire shape of the tournament. The vacuum left by Munich was not metaphorical. It was tactical, it was physical, and it was the absence of the one man who could have made the difference between going home early and going all the way. And in that same tournament, a 17-year-old Brazilian named Pelé announced himself to the world, scoring 6 goals and winning the trophy. Football historians have spent decades asking what would have happened if those two players had shared a World Cup stage in the summer of 1958. The answer is unknowable, but the question itself tells you everything about the scale of what was lost on a frozen runway in Munich 6 months before that tournament began, the 6th of February 1958. The temperature in Munich was below freezing, and the runway at Riem Airport was covered in a layer of wet, grey slush, the kind that clings to everything and makes the world feel heavier than it should. British European Airways. Flight 609 had already made 2 aborted takeoff attempts that afternoon, and the players had been in the terminal twice already. Some had ordered coffee. Some had bought gifts for people back home. Duncan Edwards had sent a telegram to his landlady in Manchester that read, "All flights cancelled. Flying tomorrow, Duncan." Then the call came to board again, and nobody challenged it. The plane taxied to the runway for the 3rd time at 3 minutes past 3 in the afternoon. And 54 seconds later, it was over. The aircraft had failed to achieve takeoff speed on the slush-covered runway. It ploughed through a fence at the end of the runway. The left wing was torn away when it struck a house, and the tail section broke off and hit a barn containing a fuel truck, which exploded in a ball of fire. 7 players died at the scene. 14 other passengers and crew also perished. The Busby Babes, that extraordinary generation of young men who were supposed to conquer Europe, were gone in less than a minute. Duncan Edwards was pulled from the wreckage alive, but his injuries were catastrophic. Fractures to both legs, broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a broken pelvis, and severe damage to his kidneys. He was taken to the Rechts der Isar hospital in Munich, where the doctors looked at what they had in front of them and did not know whether to be horrified or astonished. They had never seen a human body absorb that level of trauma and still be breathing, and they said so openly to the press. What followed was 15 days that the medical staff at that hospital would never forget for the rest of their careers. An artificial kidney machine was connected to his bloodstream, a device that was experimental by the standards of 1958 and represented the very frontier of medical technology at the time. It kept his kidneys functioning, but it also reduced his blood's ability to clot, and he began to bleed internally. The doctors were caught in a vicious circle, with the machine sustaining him while simultaneously draining the last of his reserves. And yet he fought. He fought with the same ferocity that he had brought to every tackle, every sprint, and every thunderous shot of his career. At one point, conscious and talking, he asked for a drink and was given a glass of lemonade. He asked for an apple, and then, in a moment that has become one of the most heartbreaking details in the entire history of football, he turned to assistant manager Jimmy Murphy and asked, "What time is the kickoff against Wolves, Jimmy? I mustn't miss that match." The doctors were amazed. They had never seen a body fight death with such ferocity, and they said so. On the 14th of February, his condition was reported to have dramatically improved, and the world held its breath. But the body can only fight for so long, and on the 19th of February, reports emerged that he was sinking rapidly. The artificial kidney had become, in the words of the doctors, a vicious circle that was gradually consuming the last of his reserves. On the morning of the 21st of February 1958, at 2:15 in the morning, Duncan Edwards died. He was 21 years old. Bobby Charlton, recovering at home in England, heard the news from his mother, Sissy, who placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Big Duncan has gone." Charlton would later say that Duncan's death was the biggest single tragedy ever to happen to Manchester United and England. 5 days later, more than 5,000 people lined the streets of Dudley to watch the funeral cortege pass. 5,000 people in a town that smelled of coal and iron, laid on every patch of ground he could find, who had made Bobby Charlton feel small, was coming home for the last time. His tombstone reads, "A day of memory, sad to recall, without farewell, he left us all." The echo of Duncan Edwards did not fade with time. It deepened. Manchester United, in the years that followed Munich, rebuilt themselves around something that was not just ambition or talent. It was defiance, a refusal to be defined by loss, a refusal to let the vacuum win. Matt Busby, who had been given the last rites in that Munich hospital and who had watched his greatest creation be destroyed in 54 seconds of slush and fire, came back. He built again, slowly and painfully. And in 1968, exactly 10 years after Munich, Manchester United became the first English club to win the European Cup. The blueprint for that spirit, the never say die, the refusal to yield, the 15-day war against death itself, was written by a 21-year-old from Dudley who asked about the next match while lying in a hospital bed. There is a question that haunts English football like a ghost that will not rest, no matter how many decades pass. What if Duncan Edwards had lived? What if that telegram to his landlady had been right? He had simply flown home the next day and gone on to captain England at the 1958 World Cup. What if he had played alongside Bobby Charlton for another decade, the two of them forming the most complete midfield partnership the game had ever seen? What if the positionless revolution that Cruyff and Michels brought to the world in the 1970s had arrived 10 years earlier, with Duncan Edwards as its living proof? We will never know. That is the nature of a vacuum. It is defined entirely by what is absent. And what is absent, in the story of English football, is the spectre of Duncan Edwards. The titan who made Charlton feel small, the blueprint for a revolution that came 20 years too late to include him. the boy from the Black Country who fought death for 15 days and lost by the narrowest of margins. He played 177 matches for Manchester United. He scored 21 goals. He earned 18 caps for England. He was 21 years old when he died. And he remains, to this day, the greatest what-if in the history of the game.